So the next time you hit play on a 45-minute album on Spotify or, queue up a playlist on your phone, I want you to realize something kind of crazy. You are actually obeying the physical limitations of this fragile 12-inch piece of plastic that was engineered all the way back in 1948.
Yeah, it's wild. It is entirely dictated by a format.
Right. Every time you just accept that 10 to 12 tracks is like the natural fundamental unit of music, you are basically being haunted by a mid-century ghost.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the album isn't some fundamental law of physics. It's a very specific commercial package that was invented, and then it evolved, suffered a highly publicized collapse, and then somehow it mutated to survive the digital age.
Okay, let's unpack this because today we're doing a deep dive into a really comprehensive historical breakdown of the album era. And our mission here is to figure out exactly how a physical piece of vinyl completely dictated the way artists created music, how we all consumed it, and, what it means for the way you listen to music today.
And to really get that, we have to start at the very beginning of the technology. We have to look at why the album even exists in the first place.
Because if we want to understand why your favorite artist just dropped a 12-track project today, we have to look at the mechanical constraints of the early 20th century. We have to talk about shellac.
Yes, shellac. So before 1948, recorded music was sold on these 78 RPM gramophone records.
Right.
And these were made from shellac resin, which was, frankly, incredibly heavy and just notoriously brittle.
Like drop it and it shatters into a million pieces brittle.
Exactly. But the really big limitation, the one that shaped everything, was the physical space on the disc. The grooves had to be cut so wide and the disc spun so fast that you could only fit about maybe 3 to 5 minutes of audio onto a single side.
Which completely dictated how a human being could even compose a piece of music for the public. I mean, you couldn't record a sprawling 20-minute jazz improvisation or a full symphony movement without just abruptly cutting the performance off.
Because you literally ran out of real estate on the disc. Think of cutting audio into shellac like trying to write a story in wet sand with a thick stick.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, you just run out of room almost immediately. So if a record label wanted to sell you, say, a classical symphony or a collection of pop songs by one artist, they couldn't just give you one record. They had to press multiple shellac discs and bind them together.
And they sold them in these heavy brown paper booklets, right? With these really rigid spines.
Yes, and because those booklets look absolutely identical to a standard family photo album, consumers just naturally started calling them record albums.
Which is just so fascinating. The literal name of the packaging became the name of the art form itself.
It did. The terminology stuck permanently, even though the technological barrier was finally broken in 1948. That's when Columbia Records introduced the 12-inch 33 1/3 RPM long-playing record. The LP.
The format we all know and love.
Right. They abandoned that brittle shellac for polyvinyl chloride, which was vastly quieter and just so much more durable.
So going back to your sand metaphor, vinyl basically let engineers use a fine-tip pen instead of a thick stick.
Precisely. They developed what was called a microgroove stylus. And because the material was smoother and stronger, they could cut much narrower grooves, pack them incredibly close together, and slow the rotation speed down to 33 1/3.
Wow.
So suddenly, a single disc could hold up to 52 minutes of music, 26 minutes per side.
That is such a massive leap. It's the equivalent of going from, only being allowed to read short stories your entire life to suddenly being handed the structural capacity of a full novel.
It really was.
But it's interesting to note who actually jumped on this new canvas first. Because it wasn't the early rock and roll artists like Elvis, it was actually jazz musicians, guys like Duke Ellington, who could finally capture that hypnotic, uninterrupted flow of a live club performance.
Oh, absolutely. Jazz was huge for the early LP.
And Broadway, too. I read in the source that the original cast recording of My Fair Lady actually became the very first LP to sell 1 million copies. Because it could finally fit an entire theatrical narrative onto a single disc.
Right, whereas pop and rock were still totally driven by the 45 RPM 7-inch single. The pop album in the 1950s was really just an afterthought.
Just a vehicle for the single.
Exactly. Labels would have a massive hit single and then they would hastily record 9 or 10 mediocre filler tracks just to pad out a piece of vinyl and charge a premium price for it.
Now, I actually want to challenge the accepted mythology here for a second.
Okay, lay it on me.
Whenever we talk about the album elevating from this, like cheap cash grab into a cohesive artistic statement, the concept album, everyone immediately points to the Beatles in the mid-60s.
Sure, yeah.
But looking at the timeline from our deep dive, Frank Sinatra was actually doing this a full decade earlier. He released In the Wee Small Hours in 1955, carefully sequencing these really moody, thematically linked songs about loneliness and heartbreak.
That's true.
And Ray Charles was doing it too. Plus, the Beach Boys actually beat everyone to the punch in 1963 with Little Deuce Coupe, which is a concept album of almost entirely original songwriting, all about car culture.
Well, I will defend the Beatles' placement in history here while totally conceding the groundwork you just mentioned.
Fair enough.
Sinatra undeniably linked songs thematically, but those were still largely interpretations of standards. What happens with the Beatles, specifically with Rubber Soul in late 1965, is this profound shift in intent and really cultural weight.
How so?
It wasn't just a mood anymore. It was a mandate that an album should contain zero filler. Every single song had to hold its own weight.
Ah, I see the distinction. Sinatra established the mood, but the Beatles established the album as a completely self-contained universe of original creation.
Exactly, which is what triggers the real explosion in 1967. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, Rolling Stone magazine literally called it the Big Bang of albums.
Big Bang, yeah.
And for good reason. It was the exact moment the album stopped being just a container for a radio tour and became a primary multimedia product.
Because it wasn't just the music. It came in this lavish gatefold sleeve. It had a printed lyric sheet on the back, which, prior to that, was virtually unheard of. You could actually sit there and read along with the band.
It demanded to be taken seriously as a piece of high art, akin to a great film or a novel. And economically, it proved to the entire industry that young consumers would gladly pay top dollar for these long-form, complex, artistic statements.
And that totally sets the stage for the 1970s, which is widely considered the golden age of the LP.
Without a doubt.
There's this music journalist in the source material, James Campion, and he uses a phrase to describe the 1970s album experience that I just think is brilliant. He calls it an imagination capsule.
I love that. It captures the psychology of the era perfectly.
Right. I want you to really think about the sensory reality of a teenager in the 1970s. You couldn't just pull up a YouTube video to entertain yourself. You often couldn't even control the single-family television in the living room.
You had to watch whatever your parents were watching.
Exactly. So your only escape, your only refuge, was to retreat to your bedroom. You'd drop the needle on the turntable, put on a pair of those huge, heavy over-ear headphones, turn on a mood lamp, and literally lock yourself inside this auditory dreamscape.
You became a totally captive audience.
You studied the liner notes, the gatefold art, every little cryptic symbol on the cardboard, while the music just completely enveloped you.
And the artists knew this. They leaned entirely into that physical environment. Knowing you were listening in the dark with headphones on, they experimented with all this intricate stereo panning, like making a guitar sweep slowly from your left ear over to your right.
Oh man, hearing that for the first time must have been mind-blowing.
It was revolutionary. Furthermore, the physical limitations of the vinyl record turned track sequencing into this deeply under-recognized art form. Because you had to physically stand up and flip the record after 22 minutes, artists deliberately crafted these epic side A finales to leave you in suspense.
Wow.
And then they'd write specific side B openers to pull you right back in.
I think we also need to broaden the lens of this golden age, though. Because when people hear 70s concept album, the immediate mental images, like a white progressive rock band like Pink Floyd creating the Dark Side of the Moon.
Sure, that's the cliche.
But the soul and R&B pioneers were pushing the boundaries of that imagination capsule just as hard, if not harder.
Oh, absolutely.
Isaac Hayes released Hot Buttered Soul in 1969, and it featured just 4 incredibly lush, sprawling tracks. And then you have Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder, who had to actively fight Motown executives.
Because Motown was strictly focused on churning out radio singles.
Right, they were a hit factory.
Yeah.
But Gaye and Wonder fought them to win the creative control to produce these sweeping, politically charged masterworks like What's Going On and Songs in the Key of Life.
They proved beyond a doubt that the LP was the ultimate artistic measuring stick across every single genre. But as we know, that deep, solitary listening experience couldn't last forever.
The world got a lot louder.
It did. The neon glare of the 1980s completely shattered that bedroom window. We step out of the imagination capsule and into this highly visual corporate blockbuster era driven by MTV and a shiny new format, the compact disc.
The CD. It fundamentally changes the psychology of the album.
Mhm.
Because with MTV putting the visual component front and center, an album is no longer just a record you listen to in the dark. It becomes the epicenter of a massive multimedia marketing event.
It became the extended roll-out model. Michael Jackson and Madonna really perfected this.
Oh, totally.
You didn't just drop a record and hope people bought it anymore. You released a meticulously produced lead single. You debuted a cinematic, multi-million-dollar music video on MTV just to dominate the cultural conversation.
Which was an event in itself.
Exactly. Then came the merchandise, the media blitz, and a spectacular global tour. The album was literally engineered to sustain commercial momentum for an entire calendar year or even more.
And as the mainstream pop world was becoming this massive blockbuster visual medium, hip-hop was simultaneously entering its own golden age. But it was fueled almost entirely by the discarded artifacts of the previous generation.
This is honestly one of the most beautiful instances of technological recycling in all of music history. By the late 80s and 90s, acts like Run DMC, Public Enemy, and the Beastie Boys proved that hip-hop albums could be these massive, cohesive cultural events.
But the mechanics of how those albums were actually built is the fascinating part to me.
Right.
As suburban consumers were abandoning their dusty vinyl LPs for these shiny new CDs, hip-hop producers were out there crate digging in thrift stores. They were hunting down forgotten 1970s funk and soul records.
They were looking for the raw materials.
Exactly. They would manually scrub the vinyl back and forth just to find an isolated 2-second drum break. Then they'd sample it into a drum machine and loop it to create an entirely new beat. So the forgotten physical vinyl of the 70s literally became the mechanical foundation of 90s hip-hop.
Or the old technology became the actual instrument for the new technology. But looking at the new technology itself, the CD, we run into a really precarious economic situation.
Yeah, this is the great irony of the 90s music industry, because on paper, it looks like an absolute triumph. By 1999, the industry is raking in an unprecedented $15 billion in revenue.
Huge numbers.
You have alternative rock explosions like Nirvana's Nevermind and massive country crossovers like Shania Twain, all moving tens of millions of CDs. But beneath the surface, the CD was actually destroying the structural integrity of the album itself.
What's fascinating here is that the immense profitability of the CD planted the exact seeds of its own destruction. It basically comes down to greed and capacity.
Okay, break that down.
Well, a CD was significantly cheaper to manufacture than a vinyl record. But record labels drastically increased the retail price anyway. Consumers were suddenly paying $18 for a new CD.
Which was a lot of money back then.
Yeah.
And a CD can hold about 74 minutes of audio, right? Compared to the 40 to 50 minutes of an LP.
Exactly. Which created a massive psychological trap. If a consumer is paying a premium $18, they expect to get their money's worth. So labels pressured artists to utilize that entire 74-minute capacity.
Oh, right.
This caused an absolute epidemic of filler. Instead of a tight, cohesive 40-minute artistic statement, you were getting an hour and 15 minutes of music, where maybe 3 tracks were incredible singles, and the remaining 12 tracks were vastly inferior padding just to justify the price tag.
It's like a restaurant forcing you to buy the $18 all-you-can-eat buffet when you only came in for one specific slice of pizza.
That is the perfect way to describe it.
And to make it worse, the industry intentionally stopped manufacturing cheap cast singles or CD singles. If you like that one hit song you saw on MTV, you couldn't just drop $2 on it anymore.
Nope.
The label held you hostage. You had to buy the bloated $18 buffet.
And history shows us that when you force consumers into a hostage situation over a piece of plastic, they will eventually find a crowbar.
Yep.
That crowbar was the internet. The sheer resentment of paying full price for 14 bad songs and one good one created the perfect powder keg for a digital rebellion.
Enter 1999. Napster breaks down the restaurant doors and basically lets everyone steal the pizza.
Exactly.
And then by 2001, Apple introduces iTunes and the iPod, creating a legal way to buy just the slice for 99 cents. The era of unbundling had arrived, and it was violent.
The technological walls of the album were completely breached. You no longer had to buy the filler. The album was no longer a locked, mandatory sequence determined by the artist.
You know, I want you to think back to the very first time you actually held an iPod in your hand. You suddenly wielded the power to shatter these carefully constructed imagination capsules into thousands of disconnected, randomized tracks.
What was so empowering for the listener?
You hit the shuffle button, and suddenly a Nirvana track bleeds into a Madonna song, which bleeds into a jazz instrumental. The listener seized absolute control over the sequence.
But the economic impact of that unbundling was catastrophic for the industry. Once consumers realized they only ever wanted the singles, album sales fell off a cliff. The industry plummeted from $14.6 billion in 1999 to just $6.3 billion by 2009.
Wow, cut in half.
The media universally declared it the death of the album. Pundits argued that the MP3 had permanently destroyed our attention spans, and no one would ever sit through a full-length record again.
But declaring the format dead totally ignored what the artists were actually doing on the ground. The economics collapsed, sure, but the art form survived through sheer defiance.
Right.
I mean, even amidst the piracy panic of the 2000s, you have Usher dropping Confessions in 2004 and selling 8 million physical copies. You have Eminem and Kanye West treating the hip-hop album as a monolithic, indispensable cultural event.
And in rock, you saw bands actively resisting the unbundling. Radiohead released Kid A, constructing this dense electronic post-rock landscape that deliberately lacked obvious radio singles.
Because they wanted you to listen to the whole thing.
Exactly. It fundamentally demanded to be consumed as a single, uninterrupted piece of art. Honestly, if you shuffled Kid A on your iPod, you just ruined the experience.
And that defiance brings us right into the 2010s, which is the era of the streaming metamorphosis. We move past the iPod's downloaded MP3s and into the age of Spotify, where music is essentially invisible.
It's just floating out there.
Right. It floats in the cloud, governed by playlists and algorithms. So if you're an artist and your album is no longer a physical object sitting in a store window, how do you make anyone care that you're releasing a full project?
Initially, the industry's answer was sheer, deafening spectacle. Because the music lacked physical form, the physical marketing in the real world became increasingly absurd just to overcompensate.
Oh man, the stunts.
The rollout became significantly more important than the music itself.
The attempts to capture our attention in this endless feed-scrolling world just got completely out of hand. You had Lady Gaga unveiling a literal flying dress.
I remember that.
And then there's Katy Perry, who promoted her 2013 album Prism by commissioning a gilded, gold-painted 18-wheeler truck to just drive aimlessly through the streets of Los Angeles.
Which is so funny.
And one critic in the source material accurately noted that it looked uncannily like a 10-ton brick of Cracker Barrel cheese. It was the absolute peak of rollout desperation.
It really was. And that level of excessive, noisy promotion inevitably caused a massive cultural fatigue. Consumers were just exhausted by the months-long teasing, and so the pendulum violently swung the other way, pioneered by Beyoncé.
The invention of the surprise drop.
Exactly. In late 2013, Beyoncé released her self-titled album on iTunes with zero prior announcement, no lead single, and certainly no gilded cheese trucks.
Just boom, it's there.
It was simply available in its entirety, overnight. She bypassed the exhausting marketing cycle completely, and it also neatly circumvented the internet leaks that had been bleeding the industry dry.
That was huge back then, albums leaking months early.
Right. She proved that if you possessed enough cultural gravity, you could capture the global zeitgeist instantly just by dropping a fully formed album out of the sky.
Now, while the West was navigating this frantic digital transition, moving from bloated CDs to iTunes unbundling, and then from absurd rollouts to surprise streaming drops, there's a massive glaring exception to this narrative globally.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we really have to examine Japan. The Japanese music market presents a fascinating economic phenomenon that's often referred to as Galapagos syndrome.
Wait, like the islands, meaning their market evolved in complete isolation from the rest of the world, just like the wildlife on the Galapagos Islands.
Precisely. While the United States and Europe were shuttering record stores and moving their entire lives to the digital cloud, Japan, which is the second largest music market on Earth, by the way, stubbornly and massively clung to the physical CD.
It's so wild.
Even into the mid-2010s, physical formats accounted for an astonishing 75% of their music sales.
Which seems so counterintuitive. Japan had widespread broadband internet before almost anyone else. Why were they still buying plastic discs?
Because the Japanese record industry brilliantly engineered the CD to be about much more than just audio quality. Japan has a massive idol culture groups like the boy band Arashi, for example. The agencies turned the physical CD into a token of fandom. They would hide lottery tickets to exclusive meet and greets inside the jewel cases. But more ingeniously, buying a physical CD counted as a fan vote in highly publicized, televised popularity contests for the idols.
So if you're a super fan, you aren't just buying one CD to listen to in your car. You're buying 50 copies of the exact same album to ensure your favorite singer wins the election.
Exactly. Coupled with a broader cultural reverence for physical, collectible objects and strict industry price fixing that prevented discounting, the CD remained king in Japan long after it became a relic in the West.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because the West actually ended up having its own massive physical resurgence, and it was triggered by the most unexpected global event imaginable, the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020.
The pandemic instantly neutralized the modern streaming rollout strategy. I mean, you couldn't shoot a massive music video with 100 extras anymore. You couldn't embark on a global press tour. Live concerts ceased to exist entirely, and physical record stores were forced to close their doors.
It forced a massive adaptation. Some legacy artists panicked and delayed their albums indefinitely, but others leaned into the isolation of the moment. Taylor Swift entirely abandoned her meticulous, Easter egg-filled pop rollouts and dropped Folklore as a complete surprise.
Which was brilliant.
And while everyone was trapped in their homes, this profound shift happened in the way we craved music. With stores closed and life entirely digitized, you'd assume physical media would finally suffer its killing blow. But the exact opposite happened.
Because being stuck inside, endlessly scrolling through immaterial digital feeds all day long, people developed this desperate hunger for tactility.
They wanted to touch something real.
They wanted James Campion's 1970s imagination capsule back. They wanted an excuse to step away from a screen, hold a large piece of cardboard, and commit to an uninterrupted auditory experience.
The vinyl revival went into absolute overdrive. In 2020 alone, 27.5 million vinyl records were sold in the U.S., marking the highest sales numbers in decades.
It's incredible.
Fans of modern pop, hip-hop, and indie rock were suddenly buying massive gatefold records, studying the artwork, and participating in the physical ritual of listening to side A and then flipping the disc to side B all over again.
We have truly come full circle. I mean, from the fragile 78 RPM shellac binders of the 1940s to Columbia's vinyl LP, straight into the darkened, headphone-lit bedrooms of the 70s. We survived the corporate bloat of the $18 CD, the absolute fragmentation of the iPod Shuffle, and the algorithmic dominance of Spotify.
And through all of those format wars, the album simply refuses to die.
As the legendary music critic Robert Christgau noted, making an album is fundamentally embedded in a true musician's DNA. Writing and recording a collection of songs for posterity is an irresistible urge. An artist will always want to paint on a larger canvas than a 3-minute single allows.
It's the ultimate survivor format. It has proven its ability to mutate and fill whatever technological container we invent for it, whether that's a microgroove or a cloud server. So I'd love for you to try something after you finish listening to us today. Open up your Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you keep your library. Look at all those little square album covers lined up in rows on your screen. And really think about the fact that those digital squares are the direct, unbroken descendants of those heavy, brown, 1940s photo album-style record binders.
It's a great exercise.
The technology shifted from shellac to code, but our human desire to catalog, collect, and lose ourselves in a sequence of songs hasn't changed one bit.
Which leaves us with a fascinating question as we look toward the horizon.
Oh, yeah.
We are currently standing at the edge of an era where artificial intelligence can generate endless, hyper-personalized, never-ending streams of music, algorithmically tailored to your exact mood at any given millisecond.
Sounds exhausting, honestly.
Right. So in a future of infinite generative noise, will the traditional fixed 45-minute album become the ultimate luxury item? Will committing to a single locked sequence of songs frozen in time be the only way left for an artist to truly prove they possess a human, singular vision?
If the ghost of the 1948 vinyl record has survived this long, I wouldn't bet against it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking for those imagination capsules, and we'll catch you next time.